Hey everyone, in this video what we're going to do is we're going to start taking a look at the ethical theory of utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism happens to be one of the two dominant views in ethical theory over the last 200 years, along with deontology, which we'll take a look at later on. So in this video, we'll start talking about utilitarianism, and we'll look specifically at the work of Jeremy Bentham. Let's get into it. So utilitarianism is the view that what is moral is that which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. It's a consequentialist theory of ethics, where deontology was focused on intention and what we're trying to do. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, is focused on the outcome, or what actually happens or occurs. Frankly, in utilitarianism, intentions don't matter. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. What was the result? And we're able to measure the rightness or wrongness of an action based on its results. So here are the key claims of utilitarianism. First off, the utilitarians start with this position. The desire for happiness is self-evident and universal. Now, this kind of sounds like ethical egoism. It's not, but it sounds like it. That we all desire to be happy. Utilitarians take that as a given. Also, like the ethical egoists, pleasure brings about happiness, pain brings about unhappiness. Pleasure good, pain bad. People are naturally sympathetic and concerned with promoting the happiness of others. We like to make other people happy, and we like to make other people happy often because it makes us feel good. Further, an action is morally right to the extent that it promotes the happiness or pleasure of all those affected by it. We can measure goodness by how does it affect the maximum amount of people positively. On the other hand, an action is morally wrong to the extent that it increases unhappiness or pain. And we can actually quantify this stuff. Did you make a bunch of people upset? Did you make a bunch of people unhappy? Did you injure or harm or kill a bunch of people? That's wrong. Even if it makes you really happy. The greatest happiness for the greatest number is what mitigates utilitarian ethics. Furthermore, unlike deontology, where the moral community consists of all rational beings, if there's rational beings out in the universe, beings that have minds, they're the ones that are the moral agents. They're the ones that matter. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, it's common for the moral community to consist of all sentient beings, and the definition for sentience in utilitarian ethics is that a creature can feel pleasure and pain. So a chimpanzee might not be sentient in the sense of having grand intelligence like a human being, but a chimpanzee can feel pleasure and pain, therefore they're a part of the moral community. And that's why some utilitarians, like Peter Singer, will say, animals, it's not that they have rights, but they're part of the moral community, and we need to consider the feelings, not in the sense of emotions, but feelings in the sense of pleasure and pain of other creatures in the decisions of humanity. What we do affects not just us, but those beings that experience pleasure and pain. Now, the experiences of pleasure and pain might be the result of various features that we can describe in evolutionary biology, but nevertheless, that's where we go when we want to determine what is right or wrong. Does it produce happiness and pleasure? It's good. Does it produce pain and unhappiness? It's bad, even if it has the right intention. Utilitarianism can be split into basically two kinds: rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism is the version of utilitarianism that says that actions are moral when they conform to the rules that lead to the greatest good. So we start with some basic principles, and we say these are things that we can and cannot do. On the other hand, act utilitarianism is the view that says the right action is the one which produces the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of beings, period. Whether or not certain rules are violated or not, because those rules are not in place. So in an extreme example, do you kill one person terribly through some sort of laboratory experiment to cure cancer? The act utilitarian would say, absolutely. What's one person compared to the lives of millions of people? Whereas a rule utilitarian would say, that would be great if we could cure cancer, but there's some things that we can't do. The character of Thanos in the MCU seems like a great example of a utilitarian in that he's willing to snap those fingers and get rid of half of everyone in the universe in order to do what's best for the universe. Seems like an act utilitarian. Because, yeah, are some people going to suffer? Are there going to be people missing? Are people annihilated or killed? Sure, but is it what's best for everyone, generally speaking? Yeah. Now, even though there are antecedents in utilitarianism, that is, there are people before that were developing utilitarian theory like David Hume, Jeremy Bentham is probably the first well-known utilitarian. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into a little bit of his book, Principles of Morals and Legislation. Let's start at the beginning. First off, he begins this work by talking about what he calls the principle of utility, where utilitarianism gets its name. He says this: nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne, their being pain and pleasure. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire. You might think, no, I don't really think about pain and pleasure as being the root of morality. But in reality, he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. In short, what he's saying here is if you think that morality has anything to do other than with pain and pleasure, you're wrong. Everything is under its dominion, its empire. But enough metaphor and declamation. It is not by such means that moral science is to be improved. The principle of utility is the foundation of the present work. It will be proper, therefore, at the outset to give an explicit and determinate account of what is meant by it. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness. I say of every action whatsoever, and therefore not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. By utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. All this in the present case comes to the same thing. Or, what comes again to the same thing, to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. If that party be community in general, then the happiness of the community. If a particular individual, then the happiness of that individual. The interest of the community is one of the most general expressions that can occur in the phraseology of morals. No wonder that the meaning of it is often lost. When it has a meaning, it is this: the community is a fictitious body. That is, it's not a real body as such, with members that are fused together. Community is something that we make up. That's really what the word fictitious means. Made up, kind of like a factory makes stuff. Even the words fiction and factory are related. Composed of the individual persons who are considered as constituting, as it were, its members. The interest of the community then is, what is it? The sum of the interests of the several members who compose it. It is vain to talk of the interest of the community without understanding what is the interest of the individual. A thing is said to promote the interest or be for the interest of an individual when it tends to add to the sum total of his pleasures, or what comes to the same thing to diminish the sum total of his pains. An action, then, may be said to be conformable to the principle of utility, or, for shortness' sake, to utility, meaning with respect to the community at large, when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. So what Bentham is saying here is a couple of things. One, that really pain and pleasure is the basis of morality. When we're talking about good, we mean getting more pleasure. And we're talking about bad, we mean more pain. And that's what we mean, period, when we're talking about good and bad. At the end of the day, that's what he's saying. But it doesn't mean, like ethical egoism, that it's just for the individual. I do what's in my rational self-interest. If anything, the principle of utility is a team version of ethical egoism. It's not ethical egoism, it's really ethical communitarianism. That's kind of what utilitarianism is. So we think, what's going to produce the most pleasure for everyone? And he does say it depends on what we mean by everyone. All right, what group are we talking about? Are we talking about a limited group all human beings, but that's what the principles of utility at least would be. What's going to produce, whether we're talking about our family, our town, our country, and he spends a lot of time talking about government too, so he really has the notion of the nation in mind. But also I think even all human beings altogether. What are we going to do? What is going to produce the most happiness for everyone? And when we get to what the answer to that question is, that's what good is, according to Bentham. Now, he also says there's a measured way to figure out exactly what good is for us. And it seems a bit complicated. It's a little bit later in the book. Let's take a look at that. In chapter 4 of the same work, he says, okay, how can we figure out how this is supposed to work? He says, pleasures then and the avoidance of pains are the ends, that's the purpose that the legislator has in view when we're coming up with what we're supposed to do. It behooves him, therefore, to understand their value. Pleasures and pains are the instruments he has to work with. It behooves him, therefore, to understand their force, which is, again, in other words, their value. To a person considered by himself, the value of a pleasure or pain considered by itself will be greater or less according to the 4 following circumstances: its intensity, its duration, its certainty or uncertainty, its propinquity or remoteness. Now, that's for the individual. What is it collectively? Well, he says in the next part. He says, for a number of persons, with reference to each of whom to the value of pleasure or pain is considered, it will be greater or less according to 7 circumstances, to wit, the 6 preceding ones, vis-a-vis its intensity, its duration, its certainty or uncertainty, its propinquity or remoteness, its fecundity, its purity, and one other, to wit, its extent. So some of these words, I'm sure, are unfamiliar to many of us. So let's dig into what these terms mean, and we'll look at it by means of a chart that I've put in this way. Intensity. How strong is the pleasure or pain? Reading a good book is not the same thing as an orgasm. Duration. How long is it going to last? Is this something that's going to feel good for a long time or a short time? Certainty. Do you know it's going to happen? Do you think it's going to happen? It might happen. It may not happen. You can gauge the goodness of something on the likelihood of its occurrence. Propinquity. How far away is it going to be? Propinquity is basically the notion of proximity, but in time. Proximity is how physically close something is to me. Propinquity is how temporally close something is to me. So propinquity is this going to happen tonight? Or is this going to happen 10 years from now? So, for example, when it comes to propinquity, for example, consider propinquity. If I say I'm going to give you $100 right now versus I'm going to give you $100 10 years from now, propinquity plays a part in terms of which we consider is better. Fecundity. Will this lead to more pleasure? Is it fecund? So fecundity is where one thing leads to another. It doesn't just stop, but it goes and it grows. Extent. How many people does this affect? We can measure the goodness of an action by, does this just affect me or a couple of people, my crew? Or does this affect many people, positively or negatively? That's another aspect of how we can gauge what is right and wrong. And then purity is the degree to which pleasure does not cause simultaneous pain. Something might seem like a good idea at the time. Something might seem great, but then it results in pain or some kind of cost later. So for a pleasure to be pure, it doesn't have pain associated with it. There are all kinds of things that feel good, but have consequences. For example, you getting intoxicated right now might feel awesome, but that purity goes down when you have that hangover tomorrow. So, like Jeremy Bentham suggests, if you're trying to figure out if you're doing something right and wrong, are you really going to stop in the moment, sit down and think about, you know what, how fecund is this? What's the propinquity of this? What's the extent, the purity? Are we really going to sit down and stop and do a math problem before we figure out what right and wrong is? This seems a bit obtuse. And therefore, there's some utilitarians that come later that say this isn't exactly what we want to do when we're talking about utilitarianism and figuring out what right and wrong is. Sure, pleasure and pain is the basis, and it's also not quite as simple as just saying pleasure and pain. It's a bit more than that. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the thought of John Stuart Mill, a later utilitarian who was certainly influenced by Bentham and actually knew him quite personally. But Mill is probably the quintessential figure of utilitarianism, and we'll take a look at him in the next video.